The snow had stopped just before dawn, leaving Loch Dhu wrapped in a hush so complete it felt staged, like a village holding its breath. Hogmanay had come and gone with the usual rituals, whiskey shared, songs slurred, and the careful watching of doors for the first foot who would set the tone of the year. By morning the streets were empty except for a scatter of footprints that led nowhere in particular, as if even the revellers had second thoughts about being remembered. The trouble announced itself at 7:30, when Mrs. MacInnes failed to answer her door. She was a woman of habits so rigid they could have been used to set clocks. Every New Year's morning, without fail, she opened her front door at 7 sharp to sweep out the old year's dust and let the new one in. When 7 became 7:15 and then 7:30, neighbours noticed. When knocking brought no reply, they noticed harder. The door was locked from the inside. That detail would later grow claws. Inside, the cottage was warm, the fire banked low but alive. Mrs. MacInnes lay at the foot of the stairs, one slipper twisted beneath her, her eyes open and unseeing. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. She looked as though she had simply decided, mid-step, to die. The doctor would say heart failure, but even he sounded unconvinced, as if the words tasted wrong. What unsettled everyone more was what sat neatly on the hall table, a small bottle of whiskey, unopened, with a red ribbon tied around its neck, a perfect first-foot gift. In Loch Dhu, that meant luck, provided it came from the right person. Dark-haired, preferably male, bringing coal or drink to bless the house. Mrs. MacInnes had been particular about such things. She had turned people away in past years for being fair-haired or empty-handed. This year, apparently, she had let someone in. The trouble was, no one admitted to being that someone. The snow outside the cottage told a story that refused to behave. There were footprints leading up to the door and none leading away, but they were shallow, blurred at the edges, as if pressed down and then partially erased. Hamish Macbeth crouched in the cold, staring at them with the resigned irritation of a man who had hoped for a quiet new year. He traced the prints with his eyes, noting how they began oddly close to the door, as though the walker had materialized rather than approached. Inside again, he stood in the narrow hall, breathing in peat smoke and polish. The locked door nagged at him. The key was still in the lock on the inside, turned firmly home. The windows were latched. The chimney was too narrow for anything but smoke and birds with poor judgment. If someone had come in after midnight, they had not left by any sensible route. Hamish picked up the whiskey bottle and turned it slowly. No fingerprints showed clearly, just a general smudge that could have belonged to half the village. The ribbon was neatly tied, the bow careful, almost fussy. Mrs. MacInnes had no family nearby, but she had strong opinions and stronger grudges. She was also known for her money, kept mostly in the bank but whispered about as if it lay in tempting piles under the bed. Nothing appeared missing. What made Hamish uneasy was the expression on her face. Surprise, yes, but also something like disappointment, as if she had recognized the person who stood before her door and wished too late that she had not. The villagers supplied theories with enthusiasm. Someone had poisoned the whiskey, though the bottle was unopened. Someone had frightened her to death. Someone had come through the night like a ghost. Each suggestion tangled itself around the locked door and the lying footprints, growing more elaborate by the hour. Hamish returned to the hall again and again, letting his mind walk the space. First footing was about thresholds, about who crossed them and why. Mrs. MacInnes had believed in it fiercely. She would not have opened her door without checking who stood there, which meant the visitor had been someone she trusted, or thought she did. The clue that everyone else admired, the whiskey, the ribbon, the careful observance of tradition, began to look to Hamish like a costume, a way to be welcomed without question, a way to stand inside the house without leaving in the usual manner. He looked once more at the footprints outside, at how they seemed to start too near the door, and then at the stairs where Mrs. MacInnes had fallen, her gaze fixed forever on the hall table. Whatever had happened in that narrow space had been quick, quiet, and planned. The first foot had brought luck all right, just not the kind anyone had hoped for. Hamish Macbeth stayed longer than politeness required, long after the doctor had covered Mrs. Mackinnis's face and the neighbours had retreated to whisper elsewhere. The hall felt narrower now, as if the walls were leaning in to hear what he might say. He said nothing. He merely looked, letting the place speak first. Routine came next, as it always did. Doors checked, windows tested, notes taken with the dutiful seriousness of men who preferred answers to fall into their laps. Hamish let them get on with it. Routine had its uses, but it also had blind spots, and those were where trouble liked to hide. He returned to the hall table. The whiskey bottle sat precisely centred, the ribbon's tails aligned as if measured. Too neat. Mrs. Mackinnis was tidy, yes, but this had the look of something arranged to be noticed. He touched the table's surface and felt a faint tackiness beneath his fingers, quickly wiped away. Whiskey, but not from the bottle. A drop or two spilled and cleaned in haste. His gaze drifted to the coat stand by the door. One peg was bare where the others held scarves and hats. Not missing, just used. A dark wool scarf hung slightly apart from the rest, damp at one end. Snowmelt, perhaps, but it had dripped onto the mat below, leaving a faint crescent stain that had been dabbed at, not dried properly. Someone had stood there longer than a greeting required. Outside, the footprints bothered him again. He stepped out, closing the door gently behind him, and studied the snow with fresh eyes. The marks did not fan out as they should have if someone had approached from the road. They were clustered, confused, as though the person had shifted their weight repeatedly in one spot, waiting, or hesitating. The absence of a clear departure path now seemed less mysterious and more deliberate. Someone had taken care not to leave one. Hamish straightened as a voice carried from the gate. Mrs. Mackinnis's nearest neighbour, Morag Fraser, stood wrapped in a coat that looked borrowed, her eyes bright with a mixture of grief and excitement. She talked too quickly, eager to be useful. "I heard the knock," she said, without being asked. "Just after midnight. A proper knock." I remember thinking how respectful it sounded. Hamish nodded, encouraging silence rather than words, but Morag pushed on. "I looked out, just a wee bit. Couldn't see his face, mind you. Dark coat, though. Tall enough. Brought her luck, he did. She always said this year would be a good one." "What made you think it was a man?" Hamish asked mildly. Morag blinked. "Well, the first foot's meant to be, isn't it?" "Meant to be doesn't always mean is," Hamish said. "Did you see him leave?" "No." The answer came too fast. "I went back to bed. No sense in spying." Her hands twisted the edge of her sleeves as she spoke, worrying the fabric. Hamish watched them rather than her face. When he thanked her and turned away, relief passed through her like a breeze. Back inside, Hamish noticed something else the others had missed. The stair rail bore a faint smear, darker than the wood beneath. Not blood, something greasy, transferred by a hand that had reached out in surprise. Mrs. Mackinnis had not fallen alone. Someone had been close enough to grab, or be grabbed. The constable reported no signs of poison, no wounds, nothing to justify the unease that had settled in the room. Hamish listened, then crouched once more by the door. The key was old, the metal worn smooth by decades of use. It had been turned with confidence, not fumbling. Whoever locked it knew exactly how it caught. An idea began to form, irritating in its vagueness. First footing was about entry, but also about exit. Tradition focused so heavily on the door that it ignored other thresholds. Hamish glanced toward the back of the cottage, where the kitchen window overlooked a narrow strip of frozen ground. The latch was fastened, but the sill bore a thin scratch, fresh enough to pale the wood. Not an entry, perhaps, but a staging. As the body was carried out and the house fell quiet, Hamish lingered at the threshold. Someone had come bearing luck and left without being seen, using expectation as their disguise. The lie had worked because everyone wanted it to. Somewhere between the knock at midnight and the locked door at dawn, truth had slipped on the ice, and someone in Lochdu knew exactly where it had fallen. Hamish walked slowly back toward the village, the snow crunching underfoot like a muted percussion, each step giving him a rhythm to think by. The houses of Lochdu huddled against the cold, smoke curling from chimneys, neighbours peering from curtains with expressions that tried to balance curiosity and civility. By mid-morning, the constable had gathered the usual suspects and witnesses in the small parish hall, a half-forgotten space smelling faintly of damp pews and chalk dust. Hamish leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, and let them talk. The first to speak was young Lachlan Fraser, Morag's brother, a lad whose enthusiasm often outpaced his sense. "I heard the bell, sir," he began, voice trembling just enough to suggest sincerity. "Not a clanging one, mind, but a tap at the window. I thought it might be the postman. But then I remembered. Oh, I dunno," he faltered, eyes darting around as if the hall itself might judge him for lying. Hamish watched the hesitation, noting the way his hands fiddled with the cuffs of his jacket. Timing, he realised, was the key. Lachlan wanted to impress with what he thought he remembered, not necessarily what he actually did. Next was Morag herself. She repeated her story from earlier, though this time with more embellishment. "It was a man, I'm certain of it." Dark coat, tall, brought her luck. She smiled when he came in. "Oh, Hamish, I just know it." Her eyes shone with eagerness. Too eager, thought Hamish. Truth rarely needs such insistence. It had the shape of someone trying to shape memory into certainty, not merely recount it. He turned to the local grocer, Mr. Macbeth, who had delivered Mrs. Mackinnis's last order on New Year's Eve. "No one unusual came for groceries after dark," Macbeth said, adjusting his spectacles. "At least none that I noticed. Everyone sticks to their routines. You'd see them if they strayed, believe me." His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, like he had repeated it to himself before leaving the shop. Calm people sometimes hid more than nervous ones, Hamish reflected. Hamish's gaze drifted to the back of the hall, where a cluster of older villagers whispered among themselves. He caught fragments. Don't trust him. The first foot. Not what it seemed. The words fell like loose stones in a creek, jostling for position but never settling. He approached one of the women, Mrs. Dunsmore, a widow who had lived in Lochdu long enough to recognise the tiniest breach of truth. "I saw him, Hamish," she said quietly, glancing at the others as if to keep them from overhearing. "Not the lad Morag described. The coat, it was lighter than she thinks. And the boots, polished. Too polished for the snow, I'd say. Someone meant to leave an impression, yes, but not the one we saw in the prints." Her words, careful and measured, hinted at more than just observation. They carried judgment. Hamish made a mental note. As questioning continued, contradictions surfaced like weeds through frost. Lachlan insisted he had heard a tap at the window. Morag swore the knock had been on the door. Macbeth claimed no one had ventured out after dusk, yet Mrs. Dunsmore hinted at footprints faintly visible near the back path in the early morning. Some details were minor, almost trivial. An open latch here, a misplaced glove there, but Hamish recognised them as threads. Pull one, and the whole fabric of the night might unravel. He paused when he noticed the local baker, Mr. Cairns, wringing his hands. I thought I saw someone leaving the village late at night," he admitted reluctantly, voice dropping so only Hamish could hear. "Tall, yes, dark coat, and the snow. It didn't stick right. I couldn't be certain. I shouldn't have said anything at first." His hesitation was telling. The man feared being wrong, but feared more the weight of the truth. Hamish's eyes lingered on Morag again. She had returned to whispering with the older women, her head tipped as if weighing every word. Something about her energy felt performative. She wanted to be part of the story, not merely a witness to it. And yet among the contradictions, there were hints that others were hiding too, motivated by small resentments, secret debts, or protective instincts. A village like Loch Dhu was too small for pure innocence. Everyone carried a history, and Hamish knew history often dictated what people omitted as much as what they revealed. By mid-afternoon he stood quietly at the back of the hall, letting the voices wash over him. Lies, half-truths, exaggerations, omissions, they were all there, mingled like whiskey and water. Each account shaped a slightly different picture of the night, but none explained the footprints that led nowhere, the carefully placed first foot, or the smear on the stair rail. Hamish realized that the real story was hidden between what was said and what was left unsaid. Somewhere in the crowd someone had crossed the threshold with intention, and someone else had conspired with expectation itself. The truth, he sensed, was waiting, just beyond the comfort of certainty, and he would have to pull it out, piece by careful piece. Hamish left the hall with a weight pressing against his shoulders, not heavy but insistent, the kind that grows when a case refuses to yield a single, neat answer. The snow had softened into a drizzle, leaving the village rooftops wet and glimmering, as if reflecting all half-truths and small deceptions he had just heard. Each witness had spoken with conviction, yet each story contradicted another. The problem wasn't lack of information. It was too much, and too many of the pieces wanted to hide from each other. He started with what was easiest to chart, motive. In Loch Dhu, everyone knew each other, and grudges ran as deep as friendships. Mrs. McInnes's considerable savings, though mostly banked, were whispered about in corners like a hidden treasure. Greed alone could inspire more than one person. Lachlan Fraser, he noted, had a debt to the grocer, a fact that could have made him desperate for a quick gain, though nothing in his demeanour suggested outright malevolence. Still, desperation could twist ordinary hesitation into something reckless. Morag's insistence, Hamish thought, might not be as innocent as it appeared. She had been oddly eager, almost theatrical in her accounts. There was pride in her voice, yes, but there was also the faintest edge of competition. She wanted to shape the narrative, to be the heroine of the story rather than a mere witness. And yet, could pride alone drive her to something as calculated as staging a first foot? It seemed unlikely, though not impossible. Macbeth, the grocer, had maintained his air of calm detachment, but Hamish remembered the neatness of his explanations. Timing, shopping routes, deliveries, they were all accounted for with precision. That kind of composure often masked irritation or resentment. The man had been slighted before, and small, long-brewing grievances could bloom in unexpected ways even on Hogmanay. Then there were the older villagers, their whispers thick with the static of suspicion and old memories. Mrs. Dunsmore had hinted at more than she revealed outright. She was no stranger to scheming, and her position in the village gave her the perfect vantage to manipulate small narratives, perhaps even to protect someone else. Her motive might not be immediate gain. It could be a combination of loyalty, fear, and long-standing grudges. Hamish's thoughts drifted to the whiskey bottle, still vivid in his memory, neat, tied with a ribbon, a gift meant to deceive. Whoever brought it knew the significance, knew the rules of first footing, and had used them to cloak intent. That suggested planning, forethought, and knowledge of the victim's habits. Impulsive acts were rarely so symbolic. The person who had crossed that threshold with care had a purpose beyond mere opportunity. Alibis began to fray under scrutiny. Lachlan's claim of hearing a tap at the window relied on memory muddled by excitement and proximity. Morag's certainty about the man at the door seemed rehearsed. Macbain's meticulous schedule left little room for error, yet didn't account for subtle movement outside his shop that night. Even Mrs. Dunsmore, with her careful observations, had moments of vagueness that suggested she might be shielding someone or herself. Each alibi was plausible, yet none could withstand the full test of logic if placed side by side. Hamish drew a breath and visualized the night in fragments. The knock at midnight, the opening of the door, the careful steps, the smear on the stair rail, the shallow footprints pressed and almost erased in the snow. Every action had a purpose, yet the purpose seemed to split among multiple people. Greed, perhaps, pride, definitely, fear, certainly, maybe even revenge. He began to see a lattice of connections forming. The first foot was not merely a visitor. He or she was part of a chain of expectations, obligations, and hidden resentments. The detective traced the lines between people, not events. Lachlan might have acted from desperation, but someone else had orchestrated the staging to obscure identity. Morag's eagerness could conceal a minor role she had played or witnessed. Mac Bain and Mrs. Dunsmore might have been aware of movements that night, silently guiding them or misdirecting suspicion. No single suspect held the full motive. The maze was collective, a tangle of desires, fears, and old scores that intersected at the house on New Year's morning. By evening, Hamish had a clearer picture, though it was jagged and incomplete. Every suspect had reason, yet no theory accounted for everything. The footprints, the whiskey, the locked door, the careful gestures, they were pieces meant to mislead as much as to reveal. Hamish lit his pipe and exhaled slowly, letting the smoke curl in the dim light of his small office. To untangle the motive, he would have to untangle the people one by one, discerning which lies were protective, which were performative, and which were dangerously deliberate. And he knew that in a village like Lochdu, the most ordinary smile could hide the sharpest intentions. Hamish had just finished sketching the pattern of footprints and possible movements around Mrs. Mac Innes's cottage when the constable burst in, cheeks pink from the cold and eyes wide with triumph. "Hamish, you'll not believe it, we've got him!" The excitement in the room was infectious. The other officers, who had spent hours measuring and noting, were nodding and murmuring confirmations. According to the latest report, a man matching the description given by Morag and corroborated by a grocer's distant memory had been seen leaving the village at dawn. His coat was dark, tall frame, polished boots. The authorities were already planning the arrest. The village seemed to sense victory before the details were even confirmed. Hamish studied the report with polite attention, his fingers tracing the lines of ink without urgency. Something was off, too neat, too clean. The evidence aligned perfectly with the narratives people wanted to tell, not necessarily with what had actually happened. It smelled like closure dressed in expectation, a convenient coincidence, polished and tied with a red ribbon, much like the first foot bottle in the hall. The officers crowded around, reading aloud the timeline that placed the suspect at the village outskirts just after midnight, allegedly carrying a small package that could have been the first foot gift. They praised the meticulous work, imagining the case neatly solved. "It all fits," one said, beaming. "The knock, the footprints, the bottle, everything points to him. No need for further delay." Hamish nodded, offering quiet words of praise, but inside he felt the familiar itch of unease. It wasn't that the man was innocent. He might have been involved in something, but the picture felt too simple. He revisited the cottage in his mind, the locked door, the smear on the stair rail, the carefully staged whiskey bottle, the erased footprints. None of it matched this tidy solution. Someone had anticipated the story the authorities wanted to hear, crafting a scene that fed it while hiding the real action elsewhere. He returned to the hall where the witnesses were still gathered. Morag's eyes sparkled with pride, as if she had played a role in bringing justice. Lachlan muttered under his breath, relieved to have some closure. Even Mac Bain appeared satisfied, his composed demeanour relaxing into quiet approval. Every face seemed convinced, every tension easing, except Hamish's. He crouched at the back of the hall, letting the celebratory chatter wash over him. The breakthrough was false. He could feel it in the inconsistencies he had noted, the hesitant details from the witnesses, the deliberate neatness of the staging, the subtle hints that someone else had been in the house, unseen. The first foot had not been merely a visitor, they had manipulated expectation itself. The authorities had stumbled into a shadow cast by design, not by accident. Hamish walked out into the snowy village again, eyes scanning rooftops and narrow lanes, listening to the soft crunch of his boots. Somewhere in the hush of Loch Dhu, the real culprit was still moving, waiting for the confidence of others to slip. That was the danger of a false victory. The village's relief would leave gaps, small doors left ajar, opportunities for a clever mind to strike again. He paused near the frozen fountain at the village centre, the water beneath the ice catching the weak sunlight and throwing pale patterns across the snow. He thought of the first foot bottle, still in his mind's eye, so carefully placed it had almost fooled him too. Almost. The real criminal understood symbolism, understood how belief could mask reality. And they had planned their steps accordingly, leaving just enough to satisfy the casual observer while concealing the key movements that mattered. Hamish's breath misted in the cold, and he allowed himself a slow, deliberate smile. The village would celebrate prematurely, but he would not be rushed by appearances. He already had the threads of the web, tangled though they were. The false victory was nothing more than a test, a stage set to mislead, to gauge reaction. Someone had walked through the night with purpose, leaving behind the illusions of guilt, while keeping the truth in the shadows. And Hamish, quiet and patient as always, intended to follow those shadows until they revealed the face of the first foot who lied. Hamish walked slowly along the snow-dusted streets of Loch Dhu, letting his mind drift over the events of the night. The false victory of the authorities lingered like a shadow in his thoughts, a warning that the real story was still hidden. He passed the old kirkyard, where frost clung to the gravestones, and the chill seemed to sharpen his recollection of things long buried. Often he found the present could not be understood without listening to echoes of the past. A memory nudged him, a small, seemingly trivial incident from years ago, easily overlooked in the excitement of village life. A disagreement over land between the Mackinnis family and another household, settled quietly but with lingering resentment. He remembered Mrs. Mackinnis's sharp words at the time, the way she had refused to forgive what she considered a slight, and the whispers that followed about a distant relative who had vanished from the village soon after. At the time it had seemed a minor curiosity, a footnote to village gossip, but now, in the context of the carefully orchestrated first foot, it took on new weight. He returned to the cottage, moving quietly past the cordon of constables, who were still congratulating themselves on the supposed solution. Inside, the hall was empty now, and the sunlight slanting through the windows revealed details he had not noticed before. A small mark near the bottom of the stairwell, faint but deliberate, looked like it had been scraped by metal. Not enough to injure, but enough to leave evidence of careful, repeated use. His gaze travelled across the hall and lingered on the whiskey bottle, still a silent sentinel of deception. Hamish crouched beside the bottle and let his fingers brush the dust at the table's edge. Then he remembered something else. A man who had moved away from Loch Dhu decades ago, but had returned briefly for Hogmanay in the past. The man had connections to several families in the village, including both the Mackinnis and Fraser households. He had left under a cloud, a mixture of anger and financial embarrassment, and had vanished from notice, much like some of the subtle threads in the village's history. Hamish's mind raced. Could someone from that past have returned, using the village's own traditions to manipulate perception? He retraced the footsteps, both inside and outside, and the pattern began to make a strange kind of sense. The footprints clustered near the door, the smear on the stair rail, the careful placement of the whiskey bottle. It was all consistent with someone who understood the house intimately, someone who knew both its layout and its occupants' habits. Knowledge alone was not enough. motive was required. And there Hamish began to see the connection forming: pride, long-held grievances, perhaps even revenge for perceived slights. The first foot had been chosen for trust, but the trust had been exploited. Hamish's thoughts returned to the witnesses, to Morag's eager insistence, Lachlan's nervous memory, and Mrs. Dunsmore's subtle hints. Their stories had fractured the timeline, but now he saw that the fractures were not random. They were connected to old alliances and old enmities, invisible to the casual observer. The current crime was layered atop these older hidden tensions, and the first foot had used them like building blocks for deception. He realized that someone had been preparing for this for years. The whiskey bottle, the neat ribbon, the calculated knock, all were tools to evoke confidence, to mislead, to make the authorities and witnesses assume a story that satisfied expectation. It had worked perfectly until Hamish began to map the web of past grievances against present opportunity. The connections were subtle but unmistakable: shared history, unspoken debts, old rivalries, all converging in a single deliberate act. Standing in the hall, Hamish exhaled slowly. The crime was not merely a matter of opportunity, it was a story written in layers, its chapters extending back decades. He understood now that uncovering the first foot's identity required more than following footprints or questioning witnesses. He had to unravel the ties of the past, trace the long-forgotten disputes and secret alignments, and see who had both the knowledge and the motive to strike so precisely. The village of Lochdu, with its quiet streets and polite smiles, held a history that had never truly disappeared, and in that history lay the shadow of the criminal who had walked confidently through the snow, leaving only the illusion of luck behind. Hamish returned to the cottage late in the afternoon, the low sun casting long pale shadows across the snow that now glistened with a hard crust. He had no intention of announcing his presence or acting as the authorities did. Instead, he wanted observation, patience, and the leverage of small, unusual tactics. He had realized that the first foot who lied had orchestrated much of what the village assumed to be truth, and a straightforward interrogation would only produce rehearsed stories. To catch the subtle cracks in deception, he needed to prod without accusation, to use method rather than force. He set about what he called a small experiment, one part observation, one part psychology. He arranged the hall as it had been that morning, leaving the whiskey bottle and the ribbon undisturbed. Then, with deliberate casualness, he invited Lachlan Fraser to the cottage, under the pretense of helping him retrace events for the sake of clarity. Lachlan arrived, eager to assist, cheeks flushed from the cold, hands tucked into mittens. Hamish let him talk, guiding the boy with gentle questions, pointing out the footprints in the snow and the subtle smears on the stair rail. "Notice anything unusual about the bottle?" Hamish asked, as though speaking to himself, eyes casually scanning the table. Lachlan leaned in, inspecting the ribbon, the neatness, the lack of fingerprints. "It's perfect," he said, a faint unease in his tone. "Like someone put it there on purpose." Hamish murmured. "Perfect, almost too perfect. Someone wanted it to be noticed, I'd say." He let the words hang. Lachlan's eyes widened slightly, and he shifted on his feet, glancing at the door as if considering whether to run or speak. Hamish waited, letting silence fill the space. It was remarkable how uncomfortable a boy could become under the weight of empty words. Small gestures, subtle shifts in gaze, even hesitations could reveal more than the most polished narrative. He noticed Lachlan's hands, previously relaxed, now twisting the cuffs of his coat as though trying to occupy nervous energy. "Tell me, Lachlan," Hamish said slowly, "how many people do you think would know exactly where the first foot should stand to make such an impression?" Lachlan's eyes darted toward the window, then the door, and he muttered something under his breath. Not many, I suppose." "Not many," Hamish echoed. And yet, someone arranged the bottle just so. Someone familiar with the house, with the habits of its mistress. His tone remained mild, almost idle, but the meaning hung clearly in the air. Lachlan swallowed audibly, a tiny bead of moisture forming at the corner of his lip. Not from cold, Hamish noted, but from sudden anxiety. Then, almost imperceptibly, Lachlan leaned closer, whispering, I thought I saw someone else, sir. Someone I didn't know. I shouldn't have said anything before." Hamish's gaze sharpened. The boy's slip was subtle but telling. He had been protecting something, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps both. The unusual tactic, the casual display of the scene, the emphasis on observation rather than accusation, had loosened the carefully polished surface of Lachlan's account. Hamish nodded slowly, allowing the admission to settle. "Good lad," he said softly. "Now we have more than footprints and stories. We have a clue." Lachlan blinked, eyes wide, as if he had just realized he had spoken truth without being asked. The detective then let his attention drift to the ribbon, running a fingertip along its edge and noting the faint discoloration, a hint of soot, almost invisible, trapped in the fibres. The mark suggested proximity to the fireplace, or perhaps a hand that had touched the mantel before arranging the gift, a minor detail, almost laughably small, but in the hands of someone who understood the past and the present, it became significant. Hamish knew, quietly but with certainty, that the first foot had come prepared to manipulate every witness, every assumption. Yet the combination of small observation, patient prodding, and the carefully staged haul had revealed a subtle fracture in that control. One person, one reaction, had given him a thread to follow. The web of deception was intricate, but it was not impermeable. Somewhere in the village, hidden in plain sight, the person who had crossed the threshold with deliberate intent was beginning to feel the pressure of being watched. And Hamish, with his quiet patience and unconventional methods, was ready to pull at the thread until the carefully constructed illusion unravelled completely. Hamish had spent the morning carefully retracing Lachlan's hesitant account, comparing it to the footprints, the stair rail smear, and the subtle soot on the ribbon. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a pattern that suggested a presence in the house beyond what anyone had seen. He felt the familiar pulse of anticipation, the sensation of a case finally moving from conjecture toward revelation. Then, just as he began to put his thoughts on paper, the unexpected happened. The constable arrived, hurried and pale, clutching a small envelope. "Hamish, you need to see this," he said, thrusting it toward him. Hamish opened it slowly, eyes narrowing as he read the brief note inside. "Some things are better left forgotten. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The message was unsigned, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone was actively trying to interfere with the investigation. Hamish's mind raced, considering who might have both motive and audacity to send a warning so direct. The village was small, its residents close-knit, but this felt deliberate, calculated, a shadow reaching out from behind the veil of normality. He went immediately to the hall, where the whiskey bottle and ribbon still rested in their carefully staged positions. But something had changed. The bottle had been moved slightly, a fingernail scrape along the edge of the table, faint but unmistakable. Hamish crouched, inspecting the surface. The soot he had noted yesterday was smudged, almost erased. Someone had been there after him, deliberately altering the scene. The constable reported other disturbances. The fireplace had been tidied, the footprints in the snow outside partially brushed away, and a small scrap of paper that Hamish had identified as possibly part of a letter linking the past grievances had vanished. It was as if the house itself had been rewritten overnight, carefully edited to remove inconvenient details and potential leads. Hamish's stomach tightened. The first foot, or their accomplice, had anticipated his methods. The subtle probe, the staged observation, even the psychological nudge that had loosened Luckland's memory, they had responded, erasing evidence before it could solidify into proof. What had once been a fragile advantage now seemed threatened by a more dangerous proactive hand. He thought of the witnesses, the old grudges, and the hidden connections between families. Each person had secrets, but some secrets were darker, more determined to protect themselves or someone else. Whoever had tampered with the hall was intimately familiar with the cottage and the routines of its residents, yet bold enough to act despite the risk of detection. Hamish realized that the criminal, or criminals, were not just clever, they were audacious and patient, willing to manipulate events for days, even weeks if necessary. Returning outside, he examined the snow with renewed scrutiny. The footprints that had once been shallow and confused were now disrupted, partially erased and overlapped with new misleading impressions. The scene had been altered to create doubt, a subtle misdirection that might convince anyone but the most careful observer. Hamish squatted, measuring distances, comparing impressions, and noting slight variations in depth. He recognized the hand of someone who understood the landscape as intimately as he did, a calculated attempt to bury the truth before it could surface. He lit his pipe and exhaled slowly, letting the smoke drift into the chill air. The message, the tampered evidence, and the vanishing scraps all pointed to one undeniable fact: the stakes had risen. The first foot was no longer merely hiding in expectation. They were actively shaping the investigation, choosing what would be seen and what would remain concealed. Trust, Hamish knew, had become a fragile commodity in Lochdu, and any reliance on appearances alone was now dangerous. Yet even as the tension tightened around him, Hamish felt a grim satisfaction. The interference confirmed what he had suspected all along. The perpetrator was aware of his methods and feared them. That fear was leverage. Every smudge, every missing scrap, every erased footprint was a sign of vulnerability, a crack in the careful facade. Patience, observation, and a willingness to follow even the faintest thread would reveal the criminal, he knew. The vanishing evidence had not ended the investigation, it had sharpened it, forcing him to look closer, think harder, and anticipate a mind as clever and deliberate as his own. The first foot who lied was still out there, but now Hamish could feel the hesitation, the almost imperceptible tremor of someone being watched, and he knew the moment of revelation was approaching. Hamish had barely begun to reorganize his notes when the news arrived. Swift and unnerving, Mrs. Dunsmore's cottage had been broken into overnight. The constable, breathless and bundled against the lingering chill, reported that nothing of significant monetary value appeared missing, but the scene was unnervingly precise. Drawers left half open, papers shuffled, a small chair overturned at an odd angle, as though someone had searched for a specific thing and expected it to be found. Hamish's mind raced. Whoever had tampered with Mrs. Mackinnis's cottage now moved freely among other residents, probing, testing, and erasing. The first foot who lied had escalated. It was no longer simply about hiding traces or misdirecting investigation. They were creating an atmosphere of fear, demonstrating power over the village, and signalling that they could strike at will. He hurried to the scene, observing the minor disturbances with the meticulous attention of a man who saw patterns where others saw only disorder. The snow outside bore faint, partial footprints leading to the rear garden and vanishing at the edge of the stone wall. Hamish crouched and traced the path with gloved fingers, noting how the prints faded into soft snow, as if deliberately wiped by careful steps or a quick retreat. Inside, there were signs of deliberate intimidation: a family portrait skewed, a drawer half empty, a small piece of paper, a handwritten note, placed conspicuously on the table. Look closer at the past if you hope to survive. Hamish's pulse quickened. This was no longer simply a matter of solving a crime, it was now a game of anticipation, and the rules had changed. He understood that the villain had calculated his moves, testing boundaries, gauging reactions, and sending warnings with every subtle act of disruption. Every step he had taken to uncover truth now carried risk, not just for himself, but for anyone in Lochdu connected to the case. Returning to his own office, Hamish spread the evidence across the table: footprints, photographs of smudges, the tampered whiskey bottle, and the note from Mrs. Dunsmore's cottage. The threads were converging, but the pattern remained elusive. He knew one thing for certain: the first foot who lied had moved faster than the investigation. They had not merely responded, they had anticipated. The next morning brought further complication. Lachlan, summoned for further questioning, failed to appear. A frantic search revealed him at the edge of the frozen loch, shivering and frightened, claiming he had been followed the previous night and forced into hiding. His story was chaotic, half-formed, but the terror in his eyes was real. Hamish listened carefully, noting every tremor, every hesitation, every inconsistency. It was clear. The perpetrator had begun manipulating witnesses directly, extending influence beyond simple misdirection to intimidation. Hamish walked the village streets again, observing doors, windows, and hidden alleys. His mind played through scenarios at rapid speed. Whoever had orchestrated the first crime had knowledge of the village's rhythms, habits, and vulnerabilities. They could strike anywhere, at any time, and had done so with chilling precision. Yet in that same knowledge lay their weakness: familiarity bred predictability. Each move was deliberate, but the careful repetition of patterns left openings for someone patient enough to notice. That afternoon, a small commotion drew Hamish to the village inn, where Mac Bain and Morag had gathered with others, whispering urgently. Mac Bain claimed that his ledger had been tampered with overnight, entries subtly altered. Morag, shaken, admitted that she had been followed on her walk to check on her brother. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The escalation was unmistakable. The first foot who lied was growing bold, extending the campaign from past grievances and deception to overt threats. Hamish inhaled the cold, wintry air, letting it sharpen his thoughts. He understood that the case had taken a sharp turn, evolving from a locked-room mystery into a tense game of pursuit and preemption. The criminal was still several steps ahead, using fear, uncertainty, and intimate knowledge of the village as tools, but every warning, every move left a trace, however small. The detective's task was now not only to uncover the truth behind Mrs. MacInnes's death, but to anticipate the next strike, to prevent another tragedy, and to navigate the tangled web of history, motive, and deception before the first foot could vanish once more into the shadows. Hamish pulled his coat tighter against the wind and exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The game had changed. The criminal's confidence, once subtle, was now brazen, but so too was the opportunity to trap them. If only he could think 3 moves ahead, trust his instincts, and coax the hidden truths into the light before another life was claimed. The stakes had never been higher, and Lochdu waited, silent, beneath the settling snow, for the next move. Hamish spent the next day walking the village in a deliberate circuit, retracing the movements of residents, revisiting cottages, and observing the rhythms of Lochdu in winter light. The snow, now hard-packed and glimmering, recorded every step, every shuffle, every misstep, leaving faint testimony beneath the ordinary chatter of village life. Amidst the apparent chaos, the tampered bottle, the vanished scraps of paper, Lachlan's frightened absence, Hamish began to look for consistency, not discrepancy, a pattern that others would dismiss as coincidence. It was in a small, almost trivial moment that the insight struck. While helping Morag pick up the scattered items from her brother's disrupted room, Hamish noticed how she handled a small tray of coins, aligning them with exact precision, a habit she had repeated countless times before. It was a gesture so ordinary that no one else would notice, but Hamish paused, remembering the way the first foot had arranged the whiskey bottle, neat, precise, almost ceremonial. The alignment of intent and meticulousness seemed more than habit, it was a signature. He recalled other moments, Mrs. Dunsmore's careful repositioning of objects, Luckland's fiddling with his cuffs under stress, even Mac Bain's meticulous ledger entries. Each act carried an unconscious insistence on control and symmetry, small imprints of personality that revealed itself when pressure was applied. Hamish began to map these nuances, connecting the subtle idiosyncrasies of behaviour to opportunity, proximity, and access to Mrs. Mackinnis's house. Returning to the cottage, he crouched before the hall table, letting the morning light fall across the whiskey bottle and the faint traces of soot. He realized that the minor misalignments, ribbon tails slightly uneven, dust disturbed along the edge of the table, footprints not erased perfectly, were all part of a rhythm, a deliberate deviation intended to convey confidence while concealing the orchestrated precision of the act. The criminal had created a performance, confident that others would see only luck and tradition, missing the faint signature embedded in the details. Hamish's mind connected the dots with a clarity that surprised even him. The first foot had been someone intimately familiar not only with the house but with the subtle habits of the village. The pattern of small gestures, controlled chaos and deliberate misdirection now formed a coherent map. Each act of deception, each seemingly trivial oversight by witnesses or villagers, had been anticipated and exploited. The key to unraveling the mystery was not just following evidence, it was reading behaviour, observing patterns where others saw randomness. He recalled Luckland's slip, whispered in fear, and Morag's almost performative certainty. Both were influenced by the perpetrator's understanding of the village, and both had left faint traces of truth despite attempts at control. Hamish realized that the first foot who lied had underestimated one thing: the patience to observe, the ability to let details accumulate until the pattern became undeniable. A small piece of paper previously dismissed as inconsequential now drew his attention. It had been folded precisely in thirds and tucked under the hearth, a practice Hamish recognized as someone habitually leaving notes for themselves, reminders of movement or intent. The note contained nothing overt, but its position and method of concealment aligned perfectly with the unseen steps taken throughout the village. It was a breadcrumb in a trail of meticulous care, now suddenly legible to an observer attuned to subtlety. Hamish mapped the behaviours, the tampered items, the smudges and scrapes, the faint footprints, and the pattern became unmistakable. The first foot had used predictability of habit, attention to ritual, and minute manipulations of ordinary objects to orchestrate both deception and intimidation. What had seemed random, the disrupted drawers, the vanished papers, the carefully staged whiskey bottle, was in fact part of a deliberate choreography. By late afternoon, Hamish stood in the hall once more, his gaze sweeping the room. He understood now that the case's solution had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in grand gestures or dramatic evidence, but in the subtleties of human behaviour, the repeated insistence on symmetry, and the faint, almost invisible signs of control. The first foot who lied had left a signature throughout the village, etched in small habits and precise gestures, and the moment Hamish recognised the pattern, the path to discovery, to justice, and to preventing further harm, suddenly opened before him with a clarity that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Hamish sat quietly in the parlour of Mrs. Mackinnis's cottage, letting the late afternoon sun warm the frost-stiffened room. He had traced the pattern, followed the breadcrumbs, and mapped the choreography of deliberate misdirection. Each gesture, each footprint, each carefully arranged object now fell into place. But the ultimate question remained: why? What drove someone to manipulate expectation, to stage the first foot so precisely, to intimidate and to erase evidence, all while remaining unseen? The answer was not obvious, yet it had been hiding in plain sight all along. He reviewed the connections again. Lachlan's fear, Morag's insistence, Mrs. Dunsmore's subtle guidance. They all pointed toward a network of influence, a circle of control. But someone had been pulling the strings from outside that circle, someone whose presence had been assumed, almost invisible, yet whose psychological drive had dictated every step. Hamish thought back to the minor details, the perfect alignment of objects, the faint smudge of soot on the ribbon, the tiny scrap of folded paper tucked under the hearth, the precise gestures that mirrored old habits. They were signs of obsession, not greed, calculation, not opportunity. He returned to the village ledger, to the old disputes and grudges he had unearthed. One name previously overlooked kept appearing in subtle references: Morag's distant cousin, a man who had vanished years ago after a bitter argument over inheritance and perceived slights. He had returned quietly to Lochdu, his movements invisible to all but the most careful observer. Hamish remembered Lachlan's hushed confession, the glimpse of someone unfamiliar at the cottage late at night, and Morag's own strange insistence, the subtle way she positioned herself at the edges of observation. Suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way that made the motive chillingly clear. The crime had never been about money. It had never been about revenge in the conventional sense, nor power over others in the village. The first foot who lied had acted out of a need to assert control over narrative and perception itself. Every small action, every calculated disruption, every warning note and tampered footprint was intended to shape belief, to manipulate understanding, and to demonstrate absolute mastery over both place and people. The criminal's psychology was extreme, rooted in obsession, a compulsion to engineer events to an exacting standard, to prove that no one could outmaneuver him in subtlety and foresight. Hamish's thoughts turned to the final clue, the scrap of paper folded with obsessive precision tucked under the hearth. Its contents were insignificant in themselves, fragments of reminders of lists of household minutiae, but in their placement and presentation lay a signature of compulsive control. The first foot had left behind nothing that explicitly accused, nothing that could be traced directly, yet in the careful order of small objects and movements lay a declaration: I see all, I shape all. The criminal had acted out of a psychological need to orchestrate, to dominate subtly, to bend the village's perception to his will. The implications chilled Hamish. The actions were not merely criminal, they were expressive of a mind consumed by a singular obsession. The careful staging, the intimidation, the erasure of evidence, all were tools in a meticulous performance that served no tangible gain beyond the satisfaction of psychological mastery. Every act had been deliberate, but the true motive had been invisible to those focused on conventional causes. Only by observing the minutiae, by tracing the pattern, and by patiently discerning behaviour could the depth of the first foot's intent be understood. Hamish stood and moved to the window, gazing down at the streets of Lochdu, white and quiet under the frost. The criminal was still out there, likely observing, confident in his own ingenuity, and yet, now that the hidden motive was clear, Hamish could anticipate the next steps. Understanding the psychology, the compulsive need for control and recognition through subtlety, gave him leverage. The villain's extreme obsession could be turned against him, his reliance on predictable precision exploited. In that moment the detective felt the tense thrill of approaching the final act. The hidden motive had been revealed. It was not wealth, not revenge, not envy. It was mastery, perfection, and the desperate, compulsive need to orchestrate belief. And armed with that knowledge, Hamish knew he could begin drawing the first foot out from the shadows, where obsession would clash with opportunity, and the final truth would finally emerge. The village of Lochdu held its breath, unknowingly waiting for the reckoning that was about to unfold. Hamish had spent the evening preparing quietly, moving with deliberate calm through the village streets. He had studied the patterns, traced the subtle habits, and now, with the hidden motive fully understood, He could predict the first foot's next step. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and persistent, muffling sound and leaving a fresh, unbroken surface across the lanes. It was perfect for observation and for a carefully laid trap. He positioned himself near the old kirk, a vantage point that overlooked the main route from Mrs. Macbeth's cottage. A low wall provided cover, and the lamplight cast long wavering shadows that would hide a figure until the last moment. He had arranged for the constables to remain out of sight, ready to intervene if necessary, but deliberately restrained. The final confrontation required subtlety, patience, and the illusion that the first foot could act with impunity. Hours passed in silence, the village holding its breath under the soft cloak of snowfall. Then, as predicted, a figure appeared, moving with careful precision along the cleared path of the main street. Tall, deliberate in every step, familiar with the houses and their habits, the presence was unmistakable. Hamish observed every detail, the posture, the cautious glances, the subtle scanning of windows. The first foot had come to check the result of his previous manipulations, confident that no one would anticipate such a predictable pattern of behaviour. Hamish stepped lightly from his hiding place, letting his presence be known without haste or alarm. "You've been busy," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough through the night to catch attention. The figure froze, a flicker of surprise crossing the otherwise controlled expression. All this careful planning, these little performances, for what? To prove you can control the village? The first foot's eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat, the perfect composure faltered. Then a slow, chilling smile spread. "You think you understand, detective? You cannot. Everything is as it should be. I control nothing, and yet everything obeys." There was a taut, obsessive pride in the tone, an echo of the compulsive need Hamish had uncovered. Hamish held his gaze steady and unyielding. "You control perception, yes, but not consequences. The threads you've pulled, the subtle manipulations, the threats, they're all visible to someone who knows where to look. And I've been looking. Every footprint, every misaligned ribbon, every hesitated glance, it all led me here. There's nowhere left to hide." The figure's hands twitched, an almost imperceptible gesture betraying the tension beneath the carefully maintained exterior. Hamish saw it and knew the moment had come to press the advantage. "You've orchestrated fear, tested loyalty, and erased evidence, but you cannot erase the pattern, and you cannot escape what you've already done." A gust of wind stirred the snow, brushing across the first foot's boots, leaving faint prints in the freshly fallen layer. Hamish followed them with his gaze, then stepped closer, calm, deliberate. "Every act has been deliberate, every step calculated, but patterns can be anticipated, and habits exploited. That is why you are here, and that is why it ends now." For a moment, the first foot hesitated, weighing options that had never been anticipated. Escape was tempting, but the snow betrayed every movement. The streets were quiet, and Hamish's understanding of every habitual path blocked easy flight. The obsessive control that had driven them now became a trap. Every habit, every careful gesture, left them vulnerable. The first foot's shoulders slumped, a slow surrender to inevitability. You followed the pattern," the voice came sharp and trembling. "All along, you saw it." "Yes," Hamish replied, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I saw what was always there, the patterns, the control, the obsessive care. You could not hide it from someone patient enough to watch, and now it is finished." A final desperate movement, a hand toward the pocket, perhaps for a weapon, perhaps to destroy evidence. But the constables, silent and poised nearby, stepped in instantly, closing the distance. The first foot froze, realizing escape was impossible. Hamish approached slowly, observing the eyes, still sharp, still calculating. yet finally accepting that the game had ended. "You were meticulous, yes," Hamish said, placing a firm hand on the first foot's shoulder. "But perfection is revealed by repetition, and obsession leaves a mark. Lochdu is safe now, and the truth has been seen." The figure sagged, caught between pride and defeat, as the constables led them away. Hamish watched, snow settling quietly around them, the village sleeping under a mantle of frost. The case, long tangled in deception, fear, and hidden motives, was resolved. Yet Hamish knew, as he often did, that it was patience, attention, and understanding of the subtle human habits that had won the day, not force or threat. The first foot who lied had been outmanoeuvred, not by speed, but by observation, insight, and the quiet power of seeing what others could not. The village of Lochdu exhaled, as if the snow itself had relaxed, believing the first foot who lied was finally caught. Hamish walked slowly along the main street, the soft crunch of his boots in the fresh layer of snow the only sound in the evening stillness. The constables had returned to their posts, the villagers were cautiously emerging from homes, and a fragile sense of closure seemed to hang over the rooftops. Yet Hamish felt the familiar itch of unease, that subtle whisper that told him things were rarely as neat as they seemed. He returned to Mrs. Mackinnis's cottage to inspect the hall one last time. The whisky bottle remained in place, the soot mark faint but intact, the small scrap of paper safely catalogued. Yet as he crouched to examine the floorboards, he noticed something odd. The dust along the threshold of the rear door had been disturbed recently, more than would be accounted for by the first foot's capture or the previous tampering. Curious, he traced the marks to the windowsill and then across the garden, stopping at a spot where the snow had melted slightly, revealing the outline of a small handprint, too delicate for the intruder he had just apprehended, too careful for Lachlan or any of the other villagers. A cold suspicion crept over him. Someone else had been here, someone overlooked in the flurry of arrests and confessions. His mind ran over all the interactions, all the testimonies, the subtle inconsistencies he had catalogued. The first foot had been meticulous, obsessive, and audacious. Yes, but had they acted alone? Or had they been guided, manipulated, or even coerced by another mind equally cunning? Hamish felt his pulse quicken as he revisited the constable's reports, the ledger entries, the minor discrepancies that had once seemed insignificant, a late-night visit by an unfamiliar neighbour, an offhand remark by Morag about a cousin returning unexpectedly, even the folded paper under the hearth which he had previously interpreted as a solitary signature. Now all these details hinted at another layer, an invisible hand orchestrating or at least influencing the chaos. He retraced the steps of the evening's capture in his mind. The first foot had been confident but reactive when Hamish appeared. The person's precision was extraordinary, but there had been hesitation, a flicker in the eyes, a barely noticeable pause when Hamish spoke of patterns and observation. That pause was not fear of discovery alone. It was fear of exposure to someone else, someone whose presence had not yet been revealed. The realization hit him like a sudden gust of wind. The first foot had been a pawn in a larger game, a visible face concealing the mastermind who had directed the manipulations from behind the scenes. And now that mastermind had left a subtle mark. This delicate handprint, the slight disturbance in the garden, the shadow of someone who had returned unnoticed in the aftermath of the supposed resolution. The final twist was not an act of desperation, but an assertion the game was not over, and the true mind behind the deception had waited patiently until the village's attention was elsewhere. Hamish's eyes narrowed. He began piecing together motives, connections, and access. The hidden orchestrator must have intimate knowledge of the village, of the families, of their habits. Someone trusted, someone whose presence would never be questioned, at least not until now. He reviewed every witness, every subtle behavioral clue, until one figure emerged in stark clarity, the person everyone assumed was merely peripheral, overlooked because of politeness or familiarity. Morag's own cousin, the one who had vanished years ago, whose presence had been so easily dismissed, whose return had been whispered but ignored. Hamish's mind raced. The cousin had manipulated the obsessive first foot, using the compulsion for control as a tool. Each act, the staged bottle, the tampered footprints, the psychological pressure on Lachlan, had been guided subtly, invisibly, by a mind with patience far greater than Hamish had anticipated. The first foot's obsessive tendencies had been exploited, leading the village, the constables, and even Hamish himself into believing the case was nearly solved, while the true architect waited for this exact moment. The snow continued to fall, cold and silent, as Hamish stepped back from the window. The village believed the threat had ended, but he now understood the truth. The capture of the first foot was only part of the story. The real mastermind was still at large, hidden in plain sight, testing his patience, observing his deductions, and poised to act once more. And Hamish, for the first time in the long series of events, felt the full weight of the game yet to be played, the final revelation that would test his intellect, intuition, and nerve like never before. The night had deepened, the village slept, and somewhere in Loch Dhu the true villain watched, confident that the detective had only just begun to see the outline of their design. Hamish moved quietly through the village the next morning, snow still lying in soft, untouched drifts along the lane edges. He had spent the night reviewing every detail, retracing paths, and connecting threads that had seemed peripheral but now formed a clear map to the mastermind. The first foot who lied had been clever, obsessive, and audacious, but the true villain had relied upon their obsession as a tool, manipulating both the village and the detective's assumptions. Hamish's calm certainty belied the tension he felt. He knew the game was reaching its final decisive act. He began at Mrs. Mackinnis's cottage, examining the subtle traces left by the unseen hand. The minor disturbance in the garden, the delicate handprint at the threshold, and the faint, uneven footprints in the courtyard were all indications of someone moving with familiarity, but also caution. Every movement left a signature, so subtle that others had dismissed it, but Hamish read it like a map. Each gesture connected directly to the obsessive first foot, revealing how the two had worked in tandem, one driven by compulsion, the other by calculation and hidden motive. Hamish visited Lachlan, who had finally regained some composure. Gently he guided the boy through the events of the last weeks, asking questions that probed memory rather than suggestion. As Lachlan described the figure he had glimpsed near the loch and the odd mannerisms he had observed, Hamish recognized patterns, gestures mirrored in Morag's distant cousin, the meticulous habits that had been overlooked, the deliberate timing of visits. It was a psychological choreography designed to mislead, and now, with the pieces aligned, Hamish knew precisely where and when to confront the orchestrator. The meeting was arranged in the village square, ostensibly casual, with villagers gathered for the post-Hogmanay clean-up. Hamish arrived first, positioning himself near the fountain, eyes scanning every movement. The true mastermind appeared, moving with unassuming grace, blending with the crowd as though nothing had happened, as though all the chaos had been orchestrated by someone else entirely. Hamish noted the calm confidence in the figure's posture, the controlled steps, the subtle surveying of faces, an expression of someone accustomed to manipulating perception. "Good morning," Hamish said softly, his voice carrying across the square just enough to catch attention. The figure turned, a flicker of recognition passing across the eyes. "I see you've been busy," Hamish continued, "but it seems your carefully orchestrated plan has left a trail, one small detail after another, leading straight to you." The culprit's composure wavered briefly. "You think you've seen it all?" came the measured reply, lips curving in a faint, challenging smile. I've been everywhere unnoticed. I've directed, guided, and no one would ever suspect. Hamish stepped closer, motioning toward the fountain, where the snow glistened and the soft sunlight revealed traces of movement. Yes, you directed, and yes, you guided, but the mistakes are in the details, the habits you assumed were invisible. The first foot's obsession was your tool, but also your signature. Every ribbon, every scrap of paper, every subtle alignment of objects, it was proof. And each one that you thought trivial was the thread I needed to follow. The figure's eyes darted, the first visible cracks of panic appearing, as Hamish pointed out the disrupted footprints, the soot on the whiskey bottle, the delicate handprint in the garden. You underestimated observation, Hamish said, voice steady but cold. You counted on distraction, on fear, on the assumption that others would not see the rhythm behind your orchestration. But I have, and now the truth is clear. The crowd watched in tense silence as the mastermind's composure faltered. There was a subtle hesitation, a flicker of indecision. For a moment it seemed possible they might attempt escape, but the web had been mapped completely, every route anticipated. Hamish's patience, his attention to minutiae, his understanding of human habit had cornered the villain not with force but with insight. Finally, the mastermind sagged, the careful veneer of control collapsing. You saw it, came the quiet confession. Every pattern, every step. Yes, Hamish said gently, and now justice will follow. The constable stepped forward to take the person into custody, ensuring the chain of crimes, from manipulation to intimidation, would be accounted for fully. As the village exhaled, some relief mixed with awe, Hamish reflected on the final revelation. The first foot who lied had been only a part of the story. The true villain had hidden in plain sight, relying on subtlety, distraction, and obsession. Yet it was the same subtlety that exposed them. The tiny traces, the repeated habits, the misalignments in routine. Where others had seen chaos, Hamish had seen order, and in that order lay the truth. Justice had been served, yet the lingering thought remained. How often do the smallest details hide the greatest deceptions? And as he walked through the quiet streets of Lochdu, Hamish knew that it was patience, observation, and understanding the human mind that kept him always one step ahead. Hamish walked slowly through the quiet streets of Lochdu, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots, each step punctuating the calm that had settled over the village. The first foot who lied had been apprehended, the hidden mastermind exposed, and justice, at least for now, had been served. Villagers peeked from doorways, offering cautious smiles, relieved to see the detective at ease, his coat dusted with fresh snow, his hat pulled low against the lingering chill. Yet Hamish felt a familiar restlessness beneath the surface. The case was closed in the eyes of others, but he knew the truth of investigation. Certainty is always temporary. As he passed the edge of the village square, his gaze flicked to the fountain, now glinting with frost. Something caught the corner of his eye, a small scrap of paper, fluttering from beneath a bench as if left deliberately. Hamish stooped and picked it up carefully, unfolding it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, crisp and controlled, unlike the notes the first foot had left. It contained a single line, patterns repeat, but shadows linger. A chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from recognition. Someone else, perhaps watching from afar, had chosen this moment to send a message, one subtle enough that it might have been mistaken for wind or chance. Hamish smiled faintly to himself. The village might feel safe, but the undercurrent of human complexity, of secrecy, always remained. Each thread tied to one case often unravelled into another, each truth revealed opening the door to a dozen new questions. He continued along the narrow lane, noting the footprints in the hard-packed snow. Most belonged to the villagers, their paths predictable and mundane, but one set of prints, slightly too small, slightly too light, diverged at an angle that led away from the cottages toward the wooded edge of the loch. Hamish paused, studying them closely. They were too precise to be a casual wanderer, too deliberate to be left by accident. A faint sense of curiosity, and a professional instinct honed over years, told him that someone, somewhere, was still moving in the margins, leaving traces meant to be discovered only by the observant. He tucked the scrap of paper into his coat pocket, the words echoing in his mind. Patterns repeat. Shadows linger. The first foot's obsession had been exposed, but the world was filled with patterns, with repetition and hidden intent, and Hamish knew the village could never be entirely free of subtle intrigue. It was this truth that kept him moving, alert, patient. Every corner of Loch Dhu held secrets, every human interaction could conceal intent or hint at another puzzle waiting to be solved. The detective's footsteps led him past the familiar cottages, past the churchyard where frost clung to gravestones, and toward the loch itself. The water, partially frozen, reflected the pale winter sun, glittering like scattered glass. Hamish paused, letting the silence settle, thinking of the case, the obsessive first foot, the manipulative mastermind, and the fragile interwoven web of truth and deception. In every successful resolution, he realized, there was a remnant of uncertainty, a detail too small, a message too cryptic, a motive too hidden, and that remnant was never fully gone. He glanced back at the village rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys, doors opening to friendly greetings, unaware of the quiet observer who still watched from the margins, the unseen threads yet untangled. Hamish breathed in the crisp air, feeling both satisfaction and anticipation. The first mystery was over, but the world remained full of shadows, patterns, and secrets, waiting for someone with patience and insight to see them clearly. With a measured step, he turned away from the loch and began walking toward his cottage, the snow muffling his passage, leaving only faint impressions of boots in the white expanse. Somewhere beyond the woods, beyond the edges of the village, Hamish knew another story was already beginning, a challenge subtle, clever, and layered, waiting to test the quiet genius that had solved so much already. As the wind whispered across the frozen streets, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The case was closed, yet the mystery never truly ended, and in that endless pursuit, Hamish felt both vigilance and the thrill of anticipation. The village of Loch Dhu slept under a veil of snow, peaceful but watched, as the detective's silhouette faded into the distance, leaving behind a world of questions only he seemed prepared to follow, one subtle clue at a time.